This is just the right position, so there's a glare off the clock, so I can't see it. Part of me wants to be like, woo! For your sakes, I'm watching. This morning, if you would turn in your Bibles with me to probably one of the more obscure passages, and one that I'm sure you haven't heard preached on for a while, Exodus chapter 23, verses 14 through 19. We'll be in Exodus chapter 23. I have to admit that yesterday at 8 or so in the morning, when I looked at my email and I saw that Pastor Jimmy was going to be gone, I didn't worry too much. I know God in his great wisdom and mercy usually sends me something to say. And so I was like, I'm not going to stress this. This isn't too bad. And then Pastor Jimmy suggested that, hey, you know what? Maybe you could just pick up with the sermon that I left. And I was like, you're right, maybe I could. So I went first, I looked at the title of the sermon in there, Why Lent? Why Lent? And I looked at that and went, no. I grew up in a very different tradition. I grew up in a Baptist church, and I didn't even know Lent was a non-Catholic thing until I came here last year. Okay, no idea. And I looked at it and I said, look, I looked at the passage, looked at my wife, said, this is not my wheelhouse. And I said, it may be a great thing. I didn't grow up with, I don't know where to begin with this. And then I looked again, I was like, well, let me see, he wrote me again. He says, hey, you know what, just in case, because I wrote him, I said, this is not my wheelhouse. I said, I'll just, pull something out of the sleeve. And he said, well, here, let me send you my notes to at least look over them. So, okay. So I was like, all right, I'll look. And I looked at the notes and I saw the passage that you just heard, Mary read. And I looked at it and went, no, we're not going there this morning. I was like, what am I doing with all of this? But as I started to look through Pastor Jimmy's notes, I could hear God saying, you asked me to give you what you want me to say. I emailed it to you. What more do you want? And the more I fought it, the more I came down. I was like, all right, God, guess this is where we're going this morning. And so this morning, as Pastor Jimmy's intention was, and apparently the will of God, we are going to talk about why Lent. This morning, interestingly, I noticed that the teacher me must be wearing on Pastor Jimmy because he was going to throw you a pop question, a pop quiz question. I was like, woohoo, I love that. Here we go. So I'm going to throw it out to you. How many of you with a raise of hand would say that you were listening when the scripture was being read? Oh, good. Good. Some of you are just honest, like, I'm working my checkbook. I'm sure we were in Exodus. All right. So let me ask you this. What animal was mentioned in the passage that was read? Anybody tell me? Oh, very good. Excellent. You guys get an A this morning. Those of you who are paying attention. The rest of you, shame, shame, shame. So a goat was mentioned. And we talk about this passage, and this is a really, really obscure passage. In fact, as you read commentaries on this, scholars have puzzled over this for a long time. Okay, there are just certain parts of the law that just really are tough to understand, particularly the why. The command is pretty straightforward, okay? Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, okay? Now, taking the command right there at face value, okay, that means that you don't take a goat and then take its mother's milk to cook and eat it in, okay? The very practice of doing that sounds a little bit kind of like cruel on so many different ways that you would take an animal baby and, boil it in its own mother's milk. Look at it, it's like, and there's been a lot of debate. On the one hand, you're like, well, that sounds a bit cruel. On the other hand, you're like, you're killing and eating the animal. What point does that cruelty? Where do you draw that line? And so a lot of scholars debate. It's like, well, that's just an extra step of cruelty. Some scholars have thought that, well, maybe that there was a Canaanite ritual in which they boiled a young goat in its mother's milk. And from what I can tell, archaeology has found that, though despite my most fervent searches, could not find an original source for that. But accordingly to what I read, they had found this. But you still look at this. I mean, there were a lot of other rituals that the Canaanites did. I mean, there's not like a whole list going against each one. But why this? Why this one? You know, and we talk about the law, it brings up a lot of strange laws that if you actually read through, one of the more stranger of the ones is also you were not allowed to wear a garment of mixed fabric. Okay? So if you look at your clothing today and it's like 50% cotton, 50% polyester, yeah, you just broke the law. Okay, so that was a law. And so there were a lot of ones in there, and you can really question this through. Why? Why did God give the Israelites these laws that we look at and go, but really that doesn't make any sense? That brings us a little bit to Lent. Okay? And you're probably wondering, well, where is this going? Where did Lent come from? And so this morning and last night, I was like, all right, here I go. I'm going to learn a little bit about Lent again. Now, for me growing up, this is something completely different, okay? You know, I hear Lent, someone says Lent, first thing I think is Lent? Okay, are we talking about, like the dryer? Okay, no, it is Lent. Interestingly, it comes from an Anglo-Saxon word, which for those of you who are into history will know that the Anglo-Saxons were the forerunners of the English. So that was kind of a surprise, because I would think, Latin or Greek or Hebrew, but nope. An Anglo-Saxon word actually comes from the word lengthen, okay? Same root is Lent. And apparently, this tradition started, as best they can tell, in the 300-400s AD, okay? Maybe even as early as the 200s. So this was not something that you're going to find celebrated in Acts. This was not something that the apostles told the church to keep, which means this is not a biblical command or a biblical feast. It is a tradition that grew out. Now, how did we get here? Now, interestingly, the resurrection has always been celebrated. Always. Not always on Easter. Okay? And for some of you, if you think back, does anybody know when did the early church celebrate the resurrection? When did the early church celebrate the resurrection? Looking in there. Every Sunday. Every Sunday. That's why we meet on Sunday. Okay? If we were going to follow the Jewish Sabbath, okay, the Jewish Sabbath starts Friday night at 6 o'clock, goes to Saturday. Okay? So if we were going to do a Sabbath, even with our modern time reckoning, and we start our days at midnight instead of in the evening, we would be meeting on church on Saturday. Okay? And a lot of things came out of Judaism. We don't meet on Saturdays, we don't meet on Fridays, we meet on Sundays, and the reason is that commemorates the first day of the week, the day that Jesus rose from the dead. The early Christians didn't look at, there's this one day in the year that we celebrate the resurrection. Every Sunday is a celebration of the resurrection. And somewhere along the line, that kind of changed from, again, they still met every Sunday, but somewhere along the line, they decided they should have a special day nearer to the time that Jesus actually was crucified to commemorate his death and resurrection. And so Easter began to come out of that. Now, the fasting part of this gets really interesting as well, because we know from ancient documents that there was a lot of argument over who was fasting. One of the early church fathers, Irenaeus, who lived back in the centuries after Christ had already risen and gone, he wrote a letter, and he writes the letter and says, and admits in the letter that there are a lot of Christians who can't decide, how long to fast, that there's a difference. He said, some do it for a day, some do it for 40 hours, going through, like a 24-hour period, then a 16-hour period. Well, that letter was later translated by another man, and the way he put the punctuation in made it look like Irenaeus said that there had been some people who were celebrating it for 40 days instead of just 40 hours. So the time lengthened. And as the church began looking at all this, and as we come to the Council of Nicaea and later, the church kind of looked at all the different traditions and decided that, maybe 40 days would be a great time to do it. Jesus was tempted for 40 days. We see that term 40 a lot in the Old and New Testament, really kind of representing a time of trial. And so they thought, well, this would probably be a good way, we could take those 40 days and fast, okay, as Jesus was 40 days in the wilderness, and then celebrate the the resurrection. Now, because Sunday, in their mindset, was still, we still celebrate the resurrection every Sunday, that means you wouldn't fast on those Sundays. And so you end up with a period really of 46 days, 40 days fasting, which is how we end up on the particular Wednesday that we get started. And so we talk about Lent, and its tradition is to fast. Now, originally, fast, Christians would eat only one meal a day during Lent, okay, except for on Sundays, they can fast. They don't eat one meal a day, the rest of those. That changed over time to the giving up of meat, except for fish, and then that eventually has been loosened even yet. And so now people choose, what to give up for Lent. Well, in saying that, that really brings us to the concept of sacrifice. And I want to talk a little bit about that this morning. Is really, we talk about the season of Lent, it's about giving up something, and more as a voluntary sacrifice. In Israel, we think about the sacrificial system. They had to come to the temple, they had to offer their sin offerings and such. But there were several voluntary offerings that you could. You could come to the temple with an offering just because you were glad that God was your God. You could come because you were thankful for something God did. You could come voluntarily and say, you know what? Just because I want to do something for God. We see this spirit a little bit in David as well. Turn over with me, if you would, to 2 Samuel chapter 24. 2 Samuel 24. And in this passage, David has angered God. And David has gone out and he has numbered his army. That was one of the things that the kings were not supposed to do. The kings of Israel were to trust in God, that God would be the one to supply their victory. But instead, David was going to kind of math this one out, and it's like, all right, let me see what I got, okay? God was not happy. It's like this is not how this is supposed to work. And so he sends punishment upon Israel. And it says in verse 15, so the Lord sent a plague upon Israel from the morning till the appointed time, from Dan to Beersheba, 70,000 men of the people died. So this is a pretty serious plague that is coming down. And David decides that he is going to go and he is going to offer a sacrifice to God and really to atone for what he has done. And it says in verse 18, jumping down, and Gad came that day to David and said to him, go up, erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David, according to the word of God, went up as the Lord commanded. Now Araunah looked and saw the king and his servants coming toward him. And Araunah went out and bowed before the king, his face to the ground. Then Araunah said, why has my lord the king come to his servant? And David said, to buy the threshing floor from you, to build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be withdrawn from the people. So David's commanded, you just go make it. Prophet tells him to make an altar, make a sacrifice. So David comes, and he comes to this man who owns this threshing floor that he needs to build the altar on him. And of course, the man bows down and says, hey, what can I do for you? And David tells him, he says, look, I need to buy your threshing floor. Okay? I need to offer a sacrifice. Notice the response that David gets. Again, remember, he is king. It says, now Araunah said to David, let my lord the king take and offer up whatever seems good to him. Look, here are the oxen for the burnt sacrifice, and threshing implements, and the yokes and of the oxen for wood. All these things, O king, Araunah has given to the king. And Araunah said to the king, may the Lord your God accept you. So the guy's like, hey, you know what? You're king. You know what? You're not buying this from me. Here, take it. You know what? Here's the oxen. You can slay them. Oh, you need wood? Here, take the yokes. Everything is here. It is yours. And I love what David says in response. Notice what he says. He says, no, but I will surely buy it from you for a price. Nor will I offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God with that which costs me nothing. And he looks, look, no, I'm going to buy it. How can I offer a sacrifice to God of something that costs me nothing? As I read through that, I was kind of challenged, how much does our living for Christ cost us? Are we willing to do things when there's a cost? Okay? It's easy when there's no cost. It's easy when it's like, oh yeah, well I was going to do that anyway, or oh well, that would work in my schedule, work for this. What about when it costs? If we make a sacrifice to God, are we willing to say, hey God, you know what? I'm going to do this, and it is going to cost, but that's okay, because I want to honor you with this sacrifice. When I think of Lent, this is what I think of as a time that we give up often something, but what is it that we give up? Is it something that costs, or is it something that we need to give up anyway? I think, for Lent, as you think about giving things up, one of the first things that I think a lot of people give up is, I'm going to give up chocolate for Lent, okay? And we think about, and for some, that's a cost, okay? Believe there are some. For some, it's like, well, I need a diet anyway, so I'll just give up something that's high calorie, and that'll kind of help me out where I'm at anyway. Again, the challenge is there a cost? I want to talk about 3 reasons, and we talk about traditions and giving things up. I think there's 3 reasons in our Christian life why we need to be willing to give things up, not only during Lent, but in other times of our life. I think sometimes we boil the Christian life down to kind of like living for God as a set of rules. I can do this, I can't do this, okay? What about that in between? What about the things that I give up, not because there's a command, not because I'm not allowed to do it, but just to show God my love? And I think there's 3 times that we see this mentioned in Scripture. Turn with me, and we're going to talk passages. I'll try not to go too quick. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 is the first place we're going to go. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. If you know anything about 1 Corinthians, you're probably thinking, really? 1 Corinthians? That's probably not the first place, not the first group of people I would think being willing to give up anything for anybody. And if you know anything about the church of Corinth, they had a lot of issues. And Paul, discussing with them about giving things up, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, let's read down in verse, let's go down to verse 19. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. And to those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, as without the law, not being without the law towards God, but under law towards Christ, that I might win those who are without the law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker of it with you. The first reason Paul gave up things was to spread the gospel. He mentions there, to the Jew I became a Jew. There are things that when you read in Acts, Paul did out of respect for the culture that he was working in. And there are times that to reach somebody else, we need to be willing to give something up that maybe they find offensive. I remember in Israel, there were times that when we were ministering, there were foods that we would eat that, maybe we didn't want to eat or we didn't like to eat. But we gave those up, or we ate those in order to reach those to whom we were ministering. I think about a book, Noah in his class is reading a book called Under the Overpass, an amazing book, not recommended enough, but about 2 young men who left school for a year and lived on the streets as homeless people in order to learn how better to reach the homeless community. It is a really stirring book. And when I say they lived the life to the point, one of the chapters, one of the gentlemen describes his first experience trying to eat something out of a garbage can. Okay, he was talking about, he's like, he'd been living on the streets, they didn't cheat. He's like, I was hungry, he's like, there it was. I saw some guy take his food, just took a bite out of it, threw it in the garbage can. He's like, I was hungry. He lived and they made that sacrifice for that year to learn better the needs of a population that needed more to hear about Jesus Christ. We talk about giving things up. Sometimes that requires us, we have missionaries that come, and I think about Mindy over Germany, okay, giving up where you live in your home area and being with your family in order that the gospel of Christ may be spread. The second reason sometimes that we are called to give things up is found in 1 Peter. Turn over with me to 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 1 Peter chapter 1. In 1 Peter chapter 1, in verse 15, Peter writes, "But as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, 'Be holy, for I am holy.'" I'm going to skip over and read another set of verses as well. In same book, chapter 2, jumping down verse 9, it says, "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, but not obtained mercy, but have now obtained mercy." Sometimes we need to give things up just to be different from those around us. There is the callingness of holy. We think about holy as being right. Holy means being separate. I've told you before, and I've used the illustration before, like your toothbrush. Toothbrush has one purpose: brushing your teeth. At least I hope it does, okay? I hope you don't, use your brush, you're there like, I can't find the toilet brush. Oh, here, I'll use this one. And put it back, okay? Like, no, okay? One purpose. And we also are called by God for a purpose, to his honor and his glory. My toothbrush has a very special place, okay? I don't just throw it anywhere, okay? It doesn't get thrown in the drawer, thrown on the counter, especially at my house, not on the counter because somebody else will come and grab it, okay? It's got its own special spot, its own special place that it stays, okay? We are that to God. We are a chosen people. We should have lives that are different. The question comes in, do we? Somebody from the outside were to look at modern day culture and look at our lives, is there something different? We look at Israel's commands. We talk about this one about the kid being boiled in milk or mixed clothing. Okay, what's wrong with mixing fabrics? Certainly, it's not going to cause me to sin, right? But for Israel, it was one way that God separated them. He's like, this is something I'm going to have you do so that you will be different, because you are different. And every time that you grab that garment and you realize that, hey, this is a garment made out of just one cloth, may it be a reminder to you that you are different from the world that you live in. And the last reason I believe that it's so important to sacrifice and to give things up is for our own growth. Turn over with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And Paul, again, talking to the church at Corinth and addressing some of the different issues that they had. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and in verse 12, Paul says, "All things are lawful for me, but all things are not helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any." Paul says, hey, are we under the law? No. Can I do as I see fit? Technically, yeah. He says, there are things I can do, but maybe they're not good for me. Okay? Just because I can doesn't mean I should. And I think this is the challenge, and probably the biggest challenge of the Christian life, because often we like to put that down, that dichotomy. Well, the Bible doesn't say I can't. Okay? Yeah, you're right. Okay? Does it say you can? When we look, and one of the challenges in my life is when I was younger, I always used to look at movies. And for someone asked me about a movie, the first words that would come out of my mouth, well, yeah, there wasn't anything really bad in it. And I got challenged, but was there anything really good in it? Okay. I watched a lot of movies. I could say, hey, there really wasn't anything really bad. But conversely, there really wasn't anything really good either. And we talk about our life. We're tempted to boil Christianity down to, I can do this, but I can't do that. And Paul's like, hey, you need to think about it. Is what you do, not that it's not bad for you, is it good for you? Okay? Is it something that you have mastery over, or something that has mastery over you? And one of the things about, when we think about giving up things for Lent and about the sacrifices we make, a big part of this is attitude. We can look at the Pharisees, and I know sometimes you talk about these things, people are like, oh yes, but you remember the Pharisees, they did these kinds of things and Jesus condemned them. Yeah, they did, but because their condemnation came because they made it the law and judged everybody else because they didn't do it. If God calls us in our lives to give things up, that doesn't mean he's calling your neighbor to do it, okay? Maybe God calls you to give up something, that doesn't give you the right to look at your neighbor and go, oh, hey, I'm giving this up. You should too. What's wrong with you? You're not as spiritual as I am. Okay? When we talk about making these sacrifices for God, and they can be little, and maybe if nothing else I get through to you this morning, I challenge you to start thinking about your life. What little things in your life might God be calling you to give up, either to help be more effective at spreading the gospel, to help make you a more separate, holy person, to help you grow in your spiritual life. For our family, one of the things that we have done, and again, this is not law, but for us, we don't play video games on Sundays. None of us. Okay. Now, I know people ask me all the time, and students sometimes will be talking about this, and it's like, that doesn't mean it's wrong. Nowhere would I get up here and preach, you shall not play video games on Sunday. Okay? But it's something God called us to do, because our entire family can become video game addicts. And the first time, we started thinking about this, it's like, yeah, but Sunday's our day off, it's a good video gaming day. We felt God wanted us to give this up. And for us, we needed it, because there are certain in our family, myself included, probably top of that list, who could have their lives run by video games. Okay, for those of you here who know Minecraft, I can play Minecraft nonstop for hours. Okay, you know what? And I found that in giving it up for a day, it helped me to have more control over it. And in fact, one of my sons even mentioned that not too long ago, that he's glad that we don't do it on that particular day. It's like, you know what? I need that boundary to say, hey, I need to stop. When we talk about these giving things up, and again, it's a personal thing. I would never get up here and say, you play video games today, you're not as holy as I am. Okay, this is personal sacrifice. I would challenge you, when we think about Lent, think beyond Lent. What is something in your life that you might be willing to give up in order to say, God, I want you to move me closer to you. I'm going to give this up, not because you told me I have to, but because I want to. Because I want to be more the person that you want me to be. Well, with that thought in mind, would you please stand and join with me as we sing Go Now in Peace.